Blood soaked the silver-laced mud of Oak Haven long before the true betrayal came to light. A lowly field healer pulled a dying king from the brink of oblivion, only to find herself dragged into a deadly court of fangs, ambition, and the royal mating mark that would shatter an empire. The Northern Rebellion was not a war of honorable clashes. It was a meat grinder. The rebel commander, Lord Harrington, had funded his insurrection with deep veins of silver mined from the jagged peaks of the Frostfall Mountains. Against a lycanthrope army, silver was not just a weapon. It was an agonizing, burning plague. Odette wiped a streak of soot and blood from her brow, her breath pluming in the freezing dusk air. She was no warrior, nor was she a wolf. She was simply a human apothecary from the lowlands of Oak Haven, drafted into the royal military camp when the casualties grew too steep for the pack doctors to handle. Around her, the medical pavilion was a symphony of agony. Grown men hulking brutes who could crush boulders in their wolf forms riced on wooden cots, their flesh smoking wherever Harrington's silver-alloyed shrapnel had embedded itself. Odette, more yarrow and binding moss, shouted Master Healer Cedric, a grizzled beta wolf missing half his left ear. She did not pause, snatching the woven basket of herbs and rushing to his side. They were working on a young scout, but Odette's keen eyes caught a sudden, terrifying shift in the camp's atmosphere. The flaps of the command tent violently tore open. A squad of the king's elite royal guard, the Crimson Fangs, battered their way into the healing pavilion. They were entirely covered in gore, their armor dented, and they were carrying a massive figure slung across a heavy oak shield. "Clear the center tables!" roared General Kalen, his voice cracking with a panic that silenced the entire tent. "The Alpha King has fallen. Move!" The healers scrambled, knocking over basins of bloody water in their haste. The guards hoisted the massive, unconscious body onto the reinforced wooden table. It was King Leander of the House of Sterling. Odette had only seen him from afar, a towering, fearsome monarch with a reputation for merciless justice and unmatched ferocity in battle. Now, the great Alpha King lay dying. A horrific wound tore through the left side of his chest, just inches from his heart. A massive, jagged shard of a silver-forged lance remained lodged deep in his pectoral muscle, the edges of the wound bubbling and blackening as the toxic metal poisoned his bloodstream. His breathing was a wet, ragged rattle. Gray veins spiderwebbed up his thick neck, a sign that the silver was paralyzing his Lycan healing factor. "Pull it out," Cedric ordered, his hands trembling as he grabbed the edge of the lance. With a sickening crunch, he yanked the metal free. King Leander's eyes snapped open, not human, but the glowing, molten gold of his wolf spirit. A deafening feral roar shook the canvas tent. The king thrashed violently in blind, agonizing delirium, his massive claws extending and slashing wildly. General Kalen and 3 other guards threw their weight onto the king, desperately trying to hold him down. "We need to cauterize and draw out the silver." Cedric yelled over the din, but the older healer hesitated, stepping back as the king's claws shredded the heavy leather restraints. Cedric was terrified. Any wolf who approached a maddened, dying alpha risked being torn to pieces by the sheer instinctual violence of the beast. Odette did not think. She simply moved. She grabbed a vial of concentrated wolfsbane extract, a highly dangerous substance that could kill a lichen if used improperly, but the only thing potent enough to neutralize silver poisoning in the bloodstream. Snatching a handful of raw nightshade and a sterilized iron scalpel, she pushed past the terrified master healer. "Hold him steady, General," Odette commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with a sharp, cold authority that shocked the royal guard. Before Kalen could argue, Odette climbed directly onto the edge of the table, pinning the king's uninjured shoulder with her knee to gain leverage. The Alpha's golden eyes snapped toward her, wild and furious. A low, rumbling growl vibrated from his chest, promising death. "Look at me," Odette demanded, pouring the wolfsbane directly into the gaping, smoking wound. Leander roared again, his body bucking with such force that it threw 2 guards to the floor. His massive hand shot up, his heavy claws wrapping around Odette's slender throat. The pavilion gasped. Kaelin drew his sword, ready to sever the king's arm to save the girl, but Odette raised a hand, stopping him. She didn't flinch. She kept her hazel eyes locked dead onto the king's burning golden irises. She could feel the razor-sharp tips of his claws pressing into her skin, drawing tiny drops of blood. "You are a king," she whispered, her voice steady, leaning down so only he could hear. "Do not die in the mud like a dog. Breathe." For a fraction of a second, the beast in his eyes paused. He stared at her, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent-crushed rosemary rain and the faint, coppery tang of her own blood. In that fleeting moment, an invisible electric shockwave pulsed through the air between them, making Odette's chest tighten painfully. The king's grip on her throat loosened, his hand dropping away as the wolfsbane finally took effect. The blackened veins began to recede. His golden eyes flickered back to a deep human storm gray before rolling back in his head as he slipped into a healing coma. Odette collapsed back, gasping for air, her hands stained with royal blood. She spent the next 6 hours meticulously stitching the muscle, applying herbal poultices, and wiping the fever sweat from the alpha's brow. When dawn finally broke, casting a pale light over the camp, the king's breathing had steadied. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, knowing the royal guard would soon banish all non-essential personnel from the king's side. Odette quietly packed her bloodied tools. She wiped her hands on a coarse rag, leaving it on the edge of the cot, and slipped out of the tent into the freezing morning fog, melting back into the ranks of the forgotten. 6 months later, the war was a victorious memory, but the battlefield of politics had only just begun. The great fortress of Highridge, the seat of the Lycan monarchy, was ablaze with thousands of beeswax candles. The great hall, an architectural marvel of vaulted obsidian ceilings and sweeping marble staircases, was packed with the highest nobility of the continent. King Leander had fully recovered, crushing Lord Harrington's rebellion and securing the realm. Tonight was the victory gala that the entire court knew its true purpose. The Alpha King, currently sitting upon the iron-wrought throne, was without a Luna. His pack was restless, demanding a queen to solidify the dynasty. Every noble house had brought their finest daughters, adorned in silks, diamonds, and suffocating perfumes. Foremost among them was Lady Vivienne of House Ashford. Vivienne was a pure-blood Lycan, cunning, breathtakingly beautiful, and politically ruthless. She wore a gown of deep emerald, cut dangerously low, and carried herself with the absolute certainty that the king would choose her tonight. Hidden away in the shadows of the upper balconies, far above the glittering aristocracy, Odette carried a heavy silver tray of wine goblets. After the war, her village had been slapped with heavy royal taxes to rebuild the western bridges. Unable to pay, Odette had bound herself to the royal kitchens as an indentured servant to clear the debt. She had traded the muddy hell of the medical tents for the suffocating, exhausting servitude of Highridge. She paused by a stone pillar, catching her breath, and peered down at the spectacle below. There he sat, King Leander. He looked entirely different from the bloody, broken man she had saved. He was dressed in a tailored tunic of midnight blue velvet, a heavy fur mantle draped over his broad shoulders. A silver crown rested upon his dark, unruly hair. He looked magnificent, terrifying, and utterly bored. Down on the floor, the Chancellor was reading off the commendations. Lady Vivienne stepped forward, bowing gracefully before the throne, offering a sultry smile. "House Ashford pledges its loyalty, my king," Vivienne purred, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "And we offer our most precious jewel to the crown." Leander did not look at her. His jaw was clenched, his slate-gray eyes scanning the crowd with a restless, almost predatory intensity. For 6 months he had been haunted. When he had awakened in that field hospital, his saviors had claimed it was Master Healer Cedric who performed the miracle. But Leander remembered the burning gold of his own wolf eyes, locking with defiant Hazel. He remembered the sharp voice commanding him to live. Most of all, he remembered the scent rosemary, rain, and a drop of sweet blood. He had scoured the kingdom, interrogating his generals, but in the chaos of the camp's relocation, the human girl had vanished. "My king?" Vivian prompted, a hint of irritation cracking her perfect veneer when he failed to acknowledge her. Suddenly, Leander stiffened. His nostrils flared. Up in the balcony, Odette had accidentally bumped against a passing nobleman. The wine sloshed over the rims of the goblets, splashing onto her hands. She quickly grabbed a rag to wipe it up, her heart pounding. The exertion of the night and the heat of the kitchens had caused a thin sheen of sweat to break out on her neck. Down below, the Alpha King stood up. The scraping of his iron throne against the dais echoed like a gunshot. The entire hall fell deathly silent. Leander ignored Vivienne entirely, stepping right past her as if she were a ghost. His eyes, usually a calm gray, began to bleed into a bright, dangerous gold. The beast was surfacing. "Your Grace?" General Kalen stepped forward, confused. Leander raised a hand, silencing him. The king descended the steps, walking with slow, deliberate, predatory strides down the center aisle of the great hall. A nobility parted like a Red Sea, terrified of the raw, suffocating aura of dominance radiating from their alpha. He did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed entirely on the winding stone staircase that led up to the servants' gallery. Odette's breath hitched. She saw him coming. Panic seized her chest. She backed away from the balcony railing, dropping the silver tray. It hit the floor with a loud, clattering crash that made the silence in the hall even more profound. She turned to run back toward the kitchens. "Stop!" a voice boomed. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying magical authority that forced Odette's muscles to lock in place. The Alpha command. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stone stairs. The nobility watched in stunned disbelief as their king climbed into the dusty, shadow-filled balcony meant for maids and scullery boys. Odette slowly turned around. Leander stepped into the dim light of the gallery, his massive frame blocking her only exit. For a long moment he simply stared at her. He took in her cheap, rough-spun linen dress, her tied-back hair, and the faint smudge of soot on her cheek. Then he stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He leaned down, burying his face into the crook of her neck. Odette gasped, freezing as she felt his nose brush against her skin, right where her pulse fluttered wildly. He inhaled deeply, a ragged shudder racking his massive body. "Rosemary?" he murmured against her skin, his voice a low, possessive rumble. "Rain. Blood." Down in the hall, Lady Vivian let out an indignant scoff. "My king, what are you doing with that?" "That human filth." Leander snapped his head up, his eyes entirely gold now. The snarl that ripped from his throat was so feral, so deafening, that several high-born lords dropped to their knees in submission. "You address your Luna, Vivienne of House Ashford," Leander roared, his voice bouncing off the obsidian-vaulted ceiling. "Speak of her with disrespect again, and I will tear out your tongue." A collective gasp swept through the thousands of guests. A human, a servant. Odette stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Grace, I am just, you are mine," Leander interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. He reached up, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face. The ferocity in his eyes softened to a burning, desperate devotion. "I have hunted your scent in my dreams for half a year." Before Odette could protest, before the political ramifications could even begin to process in her mind, Leander tilted her head to the side. He didn't ask for permission, and his wolf would wait no longer. Right there, in front of the horrified, gaping eyes of the highest nobility of the land, the Alpha King of the Lycans sank his elongated canines into the crook of Odette's neck. A sharp, fiery pain shot through her collarbone, immediately followed by a wave of intoxicating, euphoric heat that rushed into her bloodstream. It was the mating mark. He was binding their souls together, claiming her as his equal, his mate, and his queen. When he pulled back, a perfect crescent of blood marked her pale skin. Leander turned toward the balcony edge, pulling Odette tightly against his side, presenting her to the stunned masses below. The king had found his Luna, and the court of high-born vipers had just found their newest, most vulnerable target. The mating mark did not just change Odette's status, it altered the very chemistry of her blood. In the weeks following the victory gala, the crescent-shaped scar on her neck healed into a shimmering, silvery brand. Through it, a tether of raw emotional energy connected her mind to King Leander's. She could feel his quiet anxieties when he sat through tedious council meetings, his simmering anger when dealing with insubordinate lords, and, most overwhelmingly, his heavy, suffocating devotion to her. Yet, being elevated from a soot-stained indentured servant to the Luna of a Lycan empire overnight made Odette the most hated woman in Highridge. The bittering halls of the royal estate transformed into a gilded cage. Whispers trailed her like venomous ghosts whenever she walked the marble corridors. The pure-blood aristocracy viewed her as an abomination, a fragile, mortal stain on their ancient lineage. Leander, fiercely protective, assigned 4 of his most lethal crimson fangs to guard her door at all hours. But swords could not protect her from the political poison seeping under it. The epicenter of this malice was Lady Vivienne. Stripped of her chance of the throne, Vivienne did not retreat, she adapted. She aligned herself with Lord Charles Wentworth, a ruthlessly wealthy silver baron from the Eastern Territories whose private wealth rivaled the royal treasury. Wentworth was a man of terrifying influence, an untouchable aristocrat whose private shipping lanes controlled half the kingdom's imports. Together they orchestrated a plot not just to humiliate the new Luna, but to send her to the executioner's block. The trap was set during the Festival of the First Moon, a sacred Lycan holiday. The royal courtyards were draped in crimson silk, and the scent of roasting meats filled the autumn air. Odette sat beside Leander on a raised dais wearing a gown of woven gold that felt heavier than armor. Leander's large hand rested possessively over hers, his thumb tracing her knuckles to soothe the anxiety radiating from her side of the mating bond. "You are tense, my queen," Leander murmured, leaning close so his breath tickled her ear. "I am a human in a courtyard full of apex predators, Leander," Odette replied quietly, forcing a polite smile for the crowds below. "And half of them are glaring at me as if I am the main course." Leander's chest rumbled with a low growl, his slate-gray eyes sweeping the courtyard. "Let them glare. If any of them bare their teeth, I will break their jaws. You are their Luna." Before Odette could respond, the heavy wooden doors of the courtyard blasted open. Lord Charles Wentworth marched down the center aisle, flanked by 6 heavily armed private guards. Behind him walked Lady Vivienne, her face a mask of feigned tragedy. Wentworth held a locked iron strongbox in his hands. The music ceased. The dancing stopped. The festive atmosphere evaporated into a tense, suffocating silence. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," Wentworth declared, his voice carrying an oily smoothness. He bowed stiffly before the king. "But a matter of the highest treason has been uncovered within the castle walls." We could not wait. Leander stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the dais. The alpha aura radiating from him was heavy enough to make the lesser wolves in the crowd whimper. "Speak quickly, Wentworth. You interrupt a sacred festival." "My king," Wentworth began, unlocking the iron box. "For months we have sought the identity of the inside traitor who funded Lord Harrington's rebellion, the one who provided the rebels with the pure silver alloy that nearly claimed your life at Oakhaven." Odette felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Wentworth reached into the box and pulled out a stack of parchment bound in black leather, alongside a heavy velvet pouch. He tossed the pouch onto the stone steps of the desk. It spilled open, revealing a terrifying collection of jagged, silver-alloyed shrapnel, the exact same metal that had been pulled from Leander's chest. "We raided the underchambers beneath the apothecary wing this morning," Wentworth continued, his eyes snapping to Odette with lethal triumph. "We found this cache of rebel silver hidden beneath the floorboards, and with it a ledger." He held up the parchment. "A ledger detailing payments from the Harrington Rebellion, signed and sealed. The ledger belongs to the human you call Queen." Odette, a collective horrified gasp ripped through the courtyard. The lords and ladies surged forward, murmurs of traitor and human filth erupting from the crowd. "Lies!" Leander roared. The sheer force of his voice cracked the stone under his boots. His eyes flashed to molten gold. "You dare accuse my mate? I will have your head on a spike, Wentworth." "The evidence is undeniable, Your Grace." Lady Vivienne stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at Odette. "She was at the Battle of Oakhaven. A lowly human healer who somehow managed to save an alpha from lethal silver poisoning. It was a staged rescue. She poisoned you, then saved you to infiltrate the crown. She is a rebel spy." The court erupted into a frenzy. The Crimson Fangs drew their broadswords, forming a wall of steel around the dais. But the Lycan lords were baring their fangs, their eyes glowing in the dark. A riot was seconds away. Odette's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Leander, his fists clenched, his muscles coiled to leap down and slaughter Wentworth. But he was hesitating, not because he doubted her through the bond she felt his absolute, unshakable trust, but because if he massacred a High Lord without a trial, the kingdom would fracture into civil war. Odette realized, with sudden crystal clarity, that Leander could not save her this time. The king had to uphold the law. Luna had to save herself. "Bring me the ledger," Odette's voice rang out. It was not a shout, but a cold, cutting command that sliced through the chaos. She stood up, smoothing the skirts of her golden gown, and descended the first 2 steps of the dais. Wentworth sneered. "The accused has no right to handle the kingdom's evidence." "I am not just the accused, Lord Wentworth," Odette replied, her hazel eyes locking onto his with a ferocious intensity she didn't know she possessed. "I am your Luna, and I command you to bring me the ledger." The Alpha Command was a power usually reserved for pure-blood royals, but as Odette spoke, a wave of Leander's raw magic channeled through their mating mark and resonated in her voice. Wentworth's knees buckled slightly. Against his own will, the arrogant baron stepped forward and handed her the leather-bound book. Silence fell over the courtyard. The wind howled through the parapets as Odette opened the ledger. She scanned the pages, studying the meticulous records of silver shipments and gold payouts. She looked at the signatures at the bottom of the pages. Then she brought the parchment to her nose and inhaled deeply. A slow, chilling smile touched Odette's lips. It was a smile so ruthless it made Lady Vivienne take a step backward. "Lord Wentworth," Odette spoke, her voice echoing clearly. "You claim these are rebel ledgers from the frostbitten camps of Oakhaven, kept by my hand." "They are," Wentworth insisted, recovering his composure. "The dates align perfectly with the rebellion." "Fascinating," Odette mused. She turned to the crowd, holding the ledger up high. "I am an apothecary. My life has been dedicated to the study of roots, minerals, and chemicals. I know the scent of every poison, every cure, and every ink in this kingdom." She turned the ledger toward the torches lining the dais. "Look closely at the ink used to forge my signature. It has a distinct purplish hue. It smells faintly of iron gall mixed with crushed lapis lazuli." The nobles murmured, squinting at the pages. "Lapis lazuli is a rare gemstone," Odette continued, her voice rising with absolute authority. "It is imported exclusively from the southern coastal merchants. It is astronomically expensive. A single vial of this ink costs more than my entire village makes in a decade. Tell me, Lord Wentworth, why would a freezing, starving rebel army in the mud of Oakhaven use the most expensive luxury ink in the world to keep their illicit treason ledgers? Wentworth's face paled. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. But that is not all. Odette pressed her advantage, stepping off the dais entirely and walking directly into the center of the hostile wolf pack. She pointed to the velvet pouch of silver shrapnel. That silver is not a standard alloy. When I pulled a shard of it from the king's chest, I had to neutralize it with wolfsbane. The chemical reaction produced a specific sulfuric scorch mark. She reached out and snatched Lady Vivian's wrist. The lichen lady shrieked, but Odette held tight, yanking Vivian's silk sleeve up. If you look at the ledger's binding, Odette said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, you will see faint, black chemical burns on the leather. The person who bound this fake ledger handled the toxic silver right before writing it. The silver dust reacted with the oils of their skin. Odette had twisted Vivian's arm, exposing her pale, manicured hand to the torchlight. Along the tips of Vivian's index and middle fingers were deep, permanent, blackened chemical burns, the exact reaction of handling raw wolfsbane and refined silver alloy. "No!" Vivian shrieked, trying to rip her hand away. "She is a witch. She poisoned me." "You handled the silver," Leander's voice boomed. The king had stepped off the dais. He moved with terrifying speed, crossing the courtyard in a blur of motion. He grabbed Lord Wentworth by the throat, hoisting the heavy man 2 feet off the ground. Wentworth kicked and choked, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "You funded Harrington," Leander snarled, his golden eyes blazing with the promise of death. "You used your private trade routes to smuggle the silver, and you used Lady Vivienne to free my mate when you realized I survived." "Mercy," Vivian sobbed, dropping to her knees on the cobblestones. "The human, she doesn't belong. We had to protect the bloodline." "The only threat to my bloodline," Leander roared, tossing Wentworth to the ground at the feet of the royal guards, "is the rot of your treason. Guards, take them to the obsidian dungeons. They will be executed at dawn for high treason against the crown." "None. I scowl. So..." The crimson fangs dragged the screaming baron and the weeping lady away. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind them, leaving a stunned, breathless silence in their wake. The high lords of the Lycon court looked at the human woman standing in the center of the courtyard. She held no sword, she possessed no fangs. Yet, with nothing but her intellect and an apothecary's ledger, she had utterly dismantled the most powerful aristocrat in the kingdom and saved the crown a second time. Slowly, an elderly Alpha from the Northern Territory stepped forward. He lowered his massive head, dropping to one knee before Odette. A second lord followed, then a third. Within moments, the entire courtyard of fearsome predators had bowed, submitting entirely to their human queen. Leander walked over to her. The beast in his eyes had receded, replaced by overwhelming pride. He gently took the ledger from her trembling hands, tossing it into a nearby brazier. The flames consumed the forgery, casting a warm light over Odette's face. "You told me once in a tent slick with mud and blood not to die like a dog," Leander whispered, pulling her flush against his chest. "I think, my Luna, you have just taught my entire court how to truly live." Odette rested her head against the heavy thumping of his heart, feeling the unbreakable bond pulsing between them. The human apothecary had survived the battlefield, but the Luna had conquered the kingdom. If you were captivated by Odette's incredible rise from a battlefield healer to a fiercely brilliant Lycan queen, do not let the story end here. Hit that like button if you love the dramatic twist. Share this tale with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, original audio stories of magic, betrayal, and unbreakable mates.